who really recognized that seniority was valuable, and if you've been there a long time, you get to have all these leadership positions. We've had other speakers that care totally about loyalty and being loyal to them. So you could be brand new to the House and get all kinds of leadership positions if you sucked up to the speaker. So you can't say that seniority is the only determinant. It's a factor. I mean, it definitely plays a role. In terms of constituents, then, I would just say that they are the closest they should have the closest relationship with their constituents. That is the most representative part you have in terms of our government. So the Senate. Remember that the Senate, when it was originally created, people did not get to vote for the Senate. The 17th Amendment is what changed that during the Progressive era. So the 17th Amendment put them on our ballot, and as a result, that kind of changed the culture. Senators originally, it's all about the state. They're representing the state, and they're supposed to be the voice of the state. So even now, if you think about the fact that John Cornyn and Ted Cruz represent a huge diversity of people, Texas is big. Whereas Sam Johnson, he only represents District 3, a pretty property wealthy district, a highly educated district compared to the rest of the country. So his constituency focuses a lot more narrow than John Cornyn or Ted Cruz. Another thing that's unique about the Senate is their terms are staggered. So whereas in the House of Representatives, we have that election every 2 years, so you could theoretically have an entire new House of Representatives. You can never have that in the Senate. So John Cornyn will be eligible for re-election in 2018. Only John Cornyn. Ted Cruz will keep his job. Then in 2020, Ted Cruz's term will expire, and he can run again. In 2022, we won't vote for a senator in Texas. And it's different all over the country so that they're staggered. So that only theoretically about a third of the Senate is up for re-election every 2 years because they wanted the Senate to have this continuity. They don't want if there's some kind of like public opinion outcry. Okay, so like Trump was elected, and let's say that all those people who voted for Trump are like, oh my gosh, what do we do now? We're not going to vote for him this time. So there's backlash against the Republicans. The framers kind of wanted that felt in the House, but not felt in the Senate. And they very specifically then gave the Senate powers that they perceived as requiring more wisdom. The Senate is more powerful in terms of foreign policy. They have the power to approve or not approve treaties. They have the power to approve or not approve presidential nominations for like ambassador, like all the kind of foreign relationships. So the House, while they have a Foreign Relations Committee, it's not as important as the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate because the Senate has more influence over foreign policy. Does that make sense? The Senate Judiciary Committee is also very important because they basically are the ones that have the hearings about federal nominees for the courts. So the nomination process, like the hearings that we're going through right now, if you were on that Senate Judiciary Committee, just think about the influence you have because that person's going to get appointed to the Supreme Court and serve for life. So being first in the process definitely matters. We already talked about impeachment, and then the Senate will choose the vice president if the Electoral College doesn't produce a winner. I wouldn't say that that's that big a deal. The reason behind it would just be that the vice president is technically the president of the Senate. So, culturally, the Senate's rules are a little more loose. It's a little more personal, a little bit more friendly. You'll notice they always refer to each other as the gentleman or the gentlewoman from a certain state. There's just there's a little bit more expectation of that egalitarianism. So in terms of each chamber, question number 9, who has the most power? The Speaker of the House has the most power in the House of Representatives. That doesn't mean the Speaker's in charge, but they do wield the most authority. Historically in our country, the Speaker was supposed to be a unifying force. In this era of party polarization, I'm not so sure anymore. But the speakers, they do things like assign people to committee and assign bills to committee. And I will say, after Paul Ryan was appointed speaker, I did notice he started kind of moderating his positions a little bit. It seemed like he was trying to kind of see the other side. That was prior to the election. So I just feel like right now you guys are living in a time where things are so Republican dominated and there's such polarization that sometimes it's hard to find those examples of that. Then you have a majority leader and a minority leader. That person is basically second in command. They're the person who's kind of like in charge of their party in a way. Um, they help to kind of set the tone for, how we're going to advance the party platform, that sort of thing. And then you have a whip. The whip, the nickname for the whip is the vote counter. I kind of see them as more of an enforcer. I see them as less of a PR person and more about like, all right, Republican, what's going on? Are you going to be here? Are you going to vote? Can we count on you? Um, they're not like an assistant to the majority leader, but they're just kind of like the next step. Many times the person who is the whip eventually ends up as the majority leader, but they don't have to. In terms of the Senate, the most important figure in the Senate is the majority leader, though his or her leadership is not as influential as the commensurate part in the House. Remember that the vice president is president of the Senate, but it is a very ceremonial role. They vote only in the case of a tie, which hasn't happened for over a decade. They show up at the State of the Union and sit behind the president and smirk and smile at the camera, and Joe Biden used to sit there and tweet. It was very entertaining. But that's really it. It's very, very ceremonial. Then we have the president pro tempore, which is Latin for president for a while. Remember that person is, it's an honorific title. They're the most senior person from the majority party. And then you have all of the committee chairs. And so the committee chairs are chosen from the majority party, typically the person with most seniority, but not always. Bye, Matthew. Sure, absolutely. See you later. The importance of a congressperson's staff. Can I be honest with you? We talked about that. I think it's interesting and relevant, but I don't think I have a single question on the test about that, so don't worry about it. It matters. Staff is needed. Just their job is big. We do a lot of criticizing of Congress because Congress kind of sucks in a lot of ways, but okay. But you do have to recognize that we ask them to do a lot. We ask them to be in a lot of places at once. We ask them to do a PR job. We ask them to do a legislating job. We ask them to be at home and to be in D.C., and so that's where the staff comes into play. Okay, most important function of the committee system, when they produce that marked up bill, that's what matters. Most bills will die in committee, but the fact that they're having these hearings, that they're really vetting, that they're looking for information to try to legislate effectively, that bill that they produce now becomes what potentially could become law. Sometimes, depending on which chamber you're in, sometimes the bills can be changed on the floor, but not always. It just depends on the rules that they've set up for that. So we just expect that committee system to really kind of get down to what we need to know about that policy. If I was in the Congress and I was on the Agriculture Committee, and Katie's in the Congress and she's my buddy and she's on the Labor Committee, I'm going to defer to her. I'm going to expect her to kind of know more. I'm going to look to her for cues to how to vote. If we're friends or we're of the same party. So it's a way to support one another in a lot of ways because that person just becomes more of a specialist. How are congressional caucuses an example of modern-day factions? So remember that we said that caucuses are people that are united because they have something demographically in common. There is a women's caucus made up of women in the House and the Senate, across party lines, because there are certain issues that women are going to feel there's just going to be some commonality there. So belonging to that, you can kind of band together and definitely assert your authority. I read a headline today or yesterday about the Congressional Black Caucus. They've asked Ryan to do something with I think Nunes. I don't know if you guys have heard of it. He's the guy that's been conducting the investigation. He's the head of the committee that's investigating Trump's involvement in Russia. And I can't remember what they asked, but they're basically, so the caucus bands together and they say to Speaker Ryan, look, this is what we want you to do.
They want him to step down.
Is that, I think that's what it was.
They want him to recuse himself because he has ties to the Trump White House.
Perfect. So then if the caucus says that to Ryan is going to have to consider, look, if I don't do this, we might potentially lose the support of every member of that caucus. It's that idea of banding together. It's when you take your friend's side, right or wrong, because they're your friend. It's very much that mentality, which is exactly what Fed 10 talked about factions and how they would function. Why is the lawmaking process so lengthy and difficult? All right, well, it's so lengthy and difficult because of everything that we have to do. So first step, bills get introduced on the floor by an elected official. So it has to be either by a member of the House or the Senate. Anyone can do it. The Speaker can introduce a bill. The Majority Leader can introduce a bill. A brand new, I just got elected to the House of Representatives person can introduce a bill. So it doesn't matter as long as they are a representative or a senator. They introduce the bill. The presiding officer will sign it to committee. Typically, our committees then have subcommittees that handle smaller portions of that bill. The bill can even be broken up, which is not that big a deal. Okay? Then when the bill, if it makes it out of subcommittee by a simple majority, then it goes back to the committee of the whole. If the committee of the whole passes it by a simple majority, then it would go to the floor for debate. If it passes by a simple majority for floor debate, then it would go to the other chamber and the entire process repeats. Because the culture of the House and the Senate are different, it is very likely that the bill will pass differently from the House and the Senate, which means that we might have to have a conference committee that would work out the differences and reconcile those. No bill can make it to the president unless it is passed by a simple majority on the House and Senate floor in the exact same fashion. So if you have a bill that says we're going to cut taxes by 10% and one that says we're going to cut it by 5%, you have to reconcile those before the president is going to have an opportunity to take action. And then remember, the president can sign it, veto it, or ignore it. Signs it, it becomes law. Veto it, dies unless 2/3 of both chambers can override it. And if he or she chooses to ignore it, it will become law if Congress has been working for 10 days. If Congress has gone into recess within those 10 days, then it's what we call a pocket veto. The pocket veto cannot be overridden because that means Congress is in recess and so they're not doing any work anymore. So then what would have to happen is the member, if they want that bill to be considered, they would have to reintroduce it in the next session. And sometimes that's happened before. That's why it takes so long. Plus, that's just the textbook version. We're not accounting for interest groups and the role of the media and log rolling and deals and the president's role. You're not even talking about that. You're simply talking about that. And it's so lengthy and difficult because of bicameralism and because our framers intended for it to be that way. They wanted it to take a while. They didn't want one person to be able to change the law. Number 14, the growth of entitlements. How is that affecting the national budget? So entitlements are programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. There are some agriculture subsidies that are entitlements. They're basically programs that Congress and the President have created that have eligibility requirements. And then if you meet those requirements, then you are entitled to that program. It's almost like if you think like in Texas, how we have that top 10% rule, which is like 7% at this point, right? So if you're in the top 7% of your graduating class, you're automatically eligible to the University of Texas. That doesn't have anything to do with your SAT score, right? Okay, so you're entitled. So the deal is with that though, University of Texas kind of messes around with the percentage, right? Because it used to be 10%, but because of the number of admittees, they've been able to reduce that down to 7. The difference is with federal entitlements, you can't do that. So you can't go, well, sorry, we only have X amount of money, so this is all we can pay for Social Security, or this is all we have to cover Medicare expenses. So entitlements are becoming an increasingly large part of our budget because our population is aging, because medical technology and advancements mean not only do people live longer, but they receive more treatments. They're getting things that they didn't get before. I read a thing yesterday that said that there's a new treatment out there for a particular type of multiple sclerosis, which my mom has, so that like always kind of stands out to me. The treatment costs $65,000 a year. So if that's something that Medicare is going to end up paying for, or Medicaid is going to end up paying for, it's not as though they can say, well, we're going to pay for MS this year, so we're not going to pay for that. So as a result, all that discretionary spending is getting squeezed out. There's less money for us to spend on education.